Have you ever had one of those times when you have just had enough? One of those times that you've held your breath, you've turned away, maybe many times because you just don't like what you see going on. But then finally, you come to that point that you just can't take it anymore. You've had enough, and you decide you just can't be silent any longer, so you do something. You do something dramatic, maybe even explosive. Looking back on it, it may not have been all that smart. But enough is enough, and you did what you did, okay? If you can remember one of those times, it will help you to put this story about Jesus cleansing the temple into perspective. Let's take a minute and read the story. John 2, verses 13 through 22. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found people selling cattle, sheep, and dove, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here! Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has been 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Today's version of the story from John's Gospel takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, during the first visit to Jerusalem for Passover. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell of a similar story which occurred near the end of his ministry. People, smarter than me, question whether they are the same event, or did Jesus clear out the temple merchants twice? Both views make valid arguments, and I'm not going to enter the fray. The message we receive from the incident is the same either way, so I don't think it matters. We'll discuss that briefly a little later on, but first, let's set the stage so we can better appreciate what the story is trying to tell us. It was Passover, one of the largest holidays of the Jewish faith. Every faithful Jew who was capable was supposed to travel to Jerusalem and present an offering at the temple. By presenting their offering, they not only received forgiveness for their sins, but they were also demonstrating their loyal obedience as a faithful Jew. So Jews, including Jesus and his followers, traveled from all over the known world to be at the temple on Passover to make their sacrificial offering. Try to imagine what the Passover experience was like. The typically busy city was now stretched to the limit with visitors from around the world, wearing all manner of clothing and speaking dozens of different languages. Picture Disney World or Times Square on New Year's Eve. Not this last New Year's Eve, of course, but all the other ones. Rooms were full, streets were packed, and everyone was focused on one thing, getting to the crowded temple to offer the Passover sacrifice. The specific type of sacrifice you had to make depended on many things. Where you were from, for instance, or how old you were, what your job was, how much money you had, how nasty the sins were for which you needed to be forgiven, and a long list of other things. Your sacrifice might be as simple as a dove and a half bushel of wheat, or something not so simple like a full-sized, unblemished oxen. Most sacrifices included at least some form of animal, and the requirement was that the animal be perfect and free of blemish. This meant it should be physically perfect, clean, and healthy. This leads us to an interesting issue for those coming from out of town. Can you imagine the challenge of traveling across the country, mostly by walking the crowded and narrow roads, typically for many days, and the entire time dragging along a few crates of doves, several bushel of grain, not to mention a couple of sheep or oxen? You not only needed to keep the animals from wandering or getting injured from the hours of walking on rocky roads, but you needed to bring enough food for them so they looked nice, fat, and healthy when you finally got them through the crowds, up the steps, and into the temple. It's not surprising that most travelers thought it was best not to bring their sacrificial animals with them, but to wait and buy them once they got to Jerusalem. As a result, there was quite a variety of vendors set up in their booths around the temple, all offering the types of sacrifice that travelers would need to purchase. The vendors were able to charge a premium price. It was truly a seller's market. Just making sense of all the rules was nearly impossible for most folks. So the procedure they had to follow, and even what you actually had to sacrifice, depended a lot on how experienced you were, who you knew, and who you asked. As an example, there was one of the things people argued about was what you did with the sacrificial animal after you purchased it. Some said that you could just get it from the vendor and take it to the priests. Others argued that if you touched that animal yourself, it became unclean. So the only option was to have one of the temple workers take your animal from the vendor to the priest. That, of course, required you to pay an additional fee. Now, every rabbi interpreted the rules in their own way, so what you had to do and pay depended on just how well you knew to play the game. In addition, every person entering the temple courtyard itself was required to pay an admission fee of 1/2 shekel of Tyre. Visitors from out of town were probably carrying money from their home location, which meant they did not have 1/2 shekel of Tyre. So, you guessed it, before they could enter the temple, they had to visit one of the many money changers. The money changers were known to charge an excessive exchange rate for their services. Cha-ching! But there was more. Once you finally get your sacrifice to the temple courtyard, you would present it to one of the priests. Sacrificial animals were killed, and butchered parts of the animal were burned on the altar fire as the law required. But the rest of the meat was thrown into a large pot and cooked to be used as part of the various Passover feasts. This is important to remember because, according to the law, the priests were supposed to throw the meat into the boiling pot and let the meat cook for a while. After the meat had cooked up and begun to fall apart, the priest would take a huge fork and jab it down into the pot, and when he pulled it back up, any of the meat that was stuck to the fork would be given to the priests for their own food as part of their salary. Well, however, if we could stand and watch the people take their animals up to the priests, we would see them butcher the animal and throw scraps in the fire and drop the rest of the meat into the boiling pot. But the priest waits perhaps 30 seconds, then takes that big fork, jabs it down into the pot, and when he pulls it up, he's got a huge slab of meat that takes 2 hands to pull out of the pot. So that's the picture. Noise, crowds of people needing to buy a sacrifice, going from vendor to vendor, bickering over pricing. The animals are running everywhere, and there are the sounds and the smells that come with having animals running around all over the place. Then you have the money changers and people arguing over exchange rates. You watch the people paying to enter the courtyard and humbly presenting their sacrifice to the priests, and watch as their holy sacrifice is quickly turned into just another revenue stream for those who are running the show. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little irritated just thinking about being there. So imagine what went through Jesus' mind as he stepped up those stairs, entered the temple courtyard, and stood there watching and listening. Then he came to that moment when enough was enough. We're told he grabbed some rope and started swinging it around like a whip, chasing vendors, money changers, and livestock out of the temple courtyard. He grabbed the money boxes and poured the coins out all over the ground. That had to create a stir all by itself, don't you think? As he did this, he was shouting, "Take these things out of here and stop making my Father's house a market." Let's pause right here for just a moment to point out that Jesus was not yelling at us and telling us that we can't have bake sales or flea markets in the church. His anger was not about the fact that something was being sold, but that those doing the selling were taking complete advantage of those buying. It wasn't that money was involved. It was that one group was treating the other as if they were worthless and had no value in the eyes of God. They were doing that in the very place that was meant to be the ultimate symbol of fairness and equality among all people, God's temple. So he drew a line. He took a stand. Do you think he got a lot of attention? Yeah. But let's let Jesus go ahead and finish his house cleaning while we look around at the rest of the temple courtyard. You see over there? Yeah. Over there were those Sadducees, with the money and the power, watching Jesus cut into their income stream, something they clearly could not allow to continue. Standing next to them were the priests, wearing their fancy robes symbolizing their holiness and power, watching this preacher from Galilee make them look like a bunch of crooks. Did I mention the Romans? We can't forget the Romans. During Jesus' lifetime, the temple in Jerusalem is the second largest building in the city. The largest building was actually right next door to the temple. This was the Antonia Fortress, built by the Romans to hold squads of soldiers. Their sole purpose was to make sure that nothing ever happened in Jerusalem that might become a problem. King Herod was the current overseer of the land, and the way he kept his job was to make sure that Rome was never confronted with a problem in Jerusalem. Herod was crazy, but he was also cautious. So during the Passover holiday, we were told that he had a Roman centurion standing at every pillar in the temple area, and another squad standing at the top of the Antonia Fortress, watching, just to make sure there was never any problem. I think we can be sure they were all watching Jesus quite closely. You know, this is why, despite John placing this story at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in his account, many people believe it actually occurred shortly before the crucifixion, as described in the other gospel accounts. To these folks, it seems unlikely that the powers that be would have allowed Jesus to go back home and stir things up for another 3 years. Even the disciples realized it. As they watched him, one of them said that it reminded him of Psalm 69, in which the writer spoke to God and said, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The disciples clearly understood that what Jesus was doing was going to end up by consuming him. They might not have understood everything that was to come, but they realized he had had enough, and he wasn't going to sit back any longer. Enough was enough. Something big was going to happen. Let's end our retelling of this story with a couple of important points. First of all, as I suggested earlier, Jesus wasn't making a point about bake sales and church festivals, although some Christians argue against them based on this story. He was upset that people were not treating others as equal children of God. Second, the story is not a call for all of us to become zealous about some issue and to go out and turn over tables and drive away the evildoers. We live in a time that is running wild with zealots, each proclaiming their view of right and doing horrendous things to other human beings. No one should take this story of Jesus in the temple and use it to justify an act of abuse or terror of any kind. We don't see the world as the Son of God sees the world. So, any zealous act that we might pursue is going to be corrupted through our limited understanding. What might we take from this story? Other than understanding a bit more about why Jesus did what he did that day in the temple, the story's message seems clear. Our task is to make sure that our church, this house of God, never becomes a place in which any one person is treated as less equal to or less valuable than any other person. Our task is to keep this house of God clean of those things that might cause any person to feel less at home, less safe, or less welcome here. Our task is to obey the straightforward rule of the clean house given to us by Jesus himself. This one commandment I give to you: love one another. Amen.